because it's a framework and it's a philosophy and it's deeply nuanced, it doesn't really give you the answers like, is it appropriate to eat meat? Yes or no? It doesn't give you that answer. Should a Stoic be a vegan? Interesting question. I've developed a bit in my thoughts on this over the years. Of course, I had Kai Whiting on a couple years ago. He hasn't been around here lately. I think he's pretty busy with some projects he's working on at the moment. But we spoke about veganism. And I had been vegan for about 3 years and then kind of moved into like more of a vegetarian. I'm still mostly plant based. I don't eat a lot of meat, but I do from time to time. And I'll explain why. And, there are many historical accounts of Stoics who were vegetarians. And veganism, in and of itself, would have been very hard to achieve in the ancient world just because getting the proper nutrients you know, uh, from a world that wasn't as interconnected as it is right now would be very difficult. I mean, now you can get all kinds of things, all kinds of nutrients and supplements, and as needed, which I think everybody should be taking some form of supplement, meat eater or not, or vegetarian or vegan. But moral of the story is it would have been very difficult for you to be strictly vegan back in the day. But you do hear accounts of Stoics, ancient Stoics, who were in fact vegetarian and who aimed to reduce their meat intake. However, would it be a good thing to say that you should be a vegan? Like, if you are a Stoic, does that mean, based on the Stoic principles, the ethical principles, that you should be a vegan? And it's the question that I want to explore today, and I'll let you know where I arrive on this. It's a very nuanced episode, I suppose, with some very particular things I want to go through. But just to start off, Stoics consider themselves a member of the cosmopolitan, as they do other creatures. Now, if you look at things like Christianity, they will say that we as human beings are stewards to the planet, stewards to the sheep and the cattle and the animals of the world. And I would say that for a Stoic, it's kind of like the same thing. We're meant to be like their stewards. We're not necessarily better in the same way that, if you are walking up a mountain and you get struck by a rock and it just flattens you and just, basically kills you on the spot, a Stoic would look at that, and it might shock you to know this, but a Stoic would look at that and say, okay, well, that's not really unfortunate. And it's not a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's just that's how nature played out. And that is what happened. Death is not inherently bad. That's just the order of the cosmos. And so it wouldn't place a bad judgment on the rock, right? And it wouldn't place a good or bad judgment on the person or the person being killed. It would just say, oh, well, that's part of the plan. That's part of the cosmos. And so, all that to really say that the Stoics accepted that we have a gift, that nature gave us a gift that it has not given other creatures, and that is our prefrontal cortex. Now, they wouldn't have called it a prefrontal cortex, but in some, it's the ability to be rational, to have a rational mind, to have rational opinions, to be able to think through things logically, to fight our animalistic behaviors, and so on. And so we do, in some sense, have, a step up from a typical animal or a rock, but in the cosmopolitan sense of Stoicism, it wouldn't really place us as having any other higher value than any other natural process that happens. And so, in more or less, it considers us sort of like in a neutral playing field, in some sense, at the very least. It's not inherently, an idea in Stoicism that human beings are just better and more important than any other creature on the planet. And so that's step one. Now, step two, you could say, though the Stoics weren't pacifists by no means of the word, they weren't anti war. I'm sure there were some, if I recollect properly, but in general, the Stoics understood that sometimes you have to go to war. There's such a thing as a just war, as what would you say? I guess just violence, because that's really what war is. And so, yeah, the Stoics were, as it comes to killing, not necessarily giving it a good or negative value. It would always go back to the intention on why they were killing in the first place. And so if you're a human being and this is the example that people like to use when they're talking to a vegan, they say, well, if you were alone on a island and there was a cow there, would you kill the cow to eat? And the Stoic would say, well, yes, I would, and I would do it in a way that was as compassionate as possible. I would try and reduce suffering, but I would ultimately aim to self preserve there. Some other Stoic might say, well, based on my life as being, I don't know, let's say a long time vegan, and I've never eaten meat before in my life, I consider this to be the just act to not eat this animal. And so it's very interesting to note that in Stoicism, a particular action in and of itself doesn't necessarily make it good or bad. It depends on so many things. It depends on who you are as an individual, your history, the context, the social environment, and so on. And it's not as clear. It's not like saying killing an animal is bad, period. A Stoic would never, ever make that claim. And so we have kind of this idea, this framework in Stoicism that's like virtue ethics, but it's not like a cookie cutter program. Now, when it comes to something like animal suffering, in the same way that a Stoic would, in an ideal world, they would aim to reduce unnecessary suffering of other people. I think that's true, and it's equally as true for animals. It's hard to say that if a Stoic walked by a person that was just kicking a helpless animal, the Stoic would stop him and they would say, "Hey, listen, like you can't do this. You're creating unnecessary suffering here." And that would be the right thing to do. And I think if anyone listening to this in the Western world were to walk by someone beating up an animal, most of you would probably stop them from doing that, even though you might go and eat a chicken or a slab of steak shortly thereafter. All that to say that it's true that Stoics should aim to reduce unnecessary suffering of animals, period. Now, what does that exactly mean? Unnecessary suffering. How do you deem what's necessary and what's not? And this is where it gets very interesting because there's so many different inputs to the Stoic decision on a daily basis. And I always equate Stoicism to kind of more of a framework than it is a set of rules. So a vegan would say, never eat meat. A Stoic would say, well, it depends. Do you need to eat the meat? Do you not need to eat the meat? Do you have options? Are you born into a vegan family? Are you born into a society that is vegan or is not? And so on. Hey there. Let me thank you for being a listener to this ad-free podcast. If you enjoy the podcast, there are a few things you can do to help me out. A 5-star review on Spotify or wherever you're listening to this really does help, and it's free. You can also sign up for my Substack newsletter or Patreon. Substack free gets each episode emailed to you along with the transcripts in the form of an article. You'll also get access to my live talks, followed by a Q&A afterward. Substack Premium supporters and my patrons on Patreon get access to the recordings and a brief article of those Q&A sessions, access to full episodes of the Paradoxically Speaking podcast, my Steps to Success interview series, Stoic meditations, and much more. Links to Substack and Patreon can be found in the show notes. And so let me walk you through a little bit of my journey with this. So I was a strict vegan for 3 years, more out of curiosity than anything else. Yes, there was an ethical component of it. Yes, there was an environmental component of it. But more or less, I was kind of curious, like what would happen. You hear all these myths about vegans not being able to be strong. I maintained my strength. I didn't find any issue with it whatsoever when it came to physical performance. And then what happened was I started working a job that I have now where I started to have to travel more. So I'd be going to boats to see my crew on my tugboats. I'd be going out to dinners with clients and customers. And I'd be going to sometimes some remote areas where you didn't have a whole lot of vegan options. And so what I started to do was I would have meat when I traveled, or not necessarily meat, but I might not necessarily be a strict vegan when I traveled. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned, based on that job that I had and have now at the time, it's extremely difficult for me to be a strict vegan. And second of all, and this is the more important thing when it comes to Stoicism, it makes me antisocial if I try and be a strict vegan. And let me explain what that means. If you go on a tugboat or a boat, a ship, if you've ever visited one of the most important things is the meal, which is the same in any human environment. People love to share a meal with you. It's sort of this welcoming thing. You break bread, it represents peace, it represents welcoming. And so if you go, let's say, to somebody's house for supper, or in my case, on a boat, and they offer you a meal, and you refuse to eat anything because you're vegan and you don't want to touch the meat, that's antisocial. And again, this is a very nuanced thing, and it depends on who you are. I wasn't born vegan. My family was never vegan. This was something that I adopted later in life. So, for the context of who I am, it's not as solidified in my personality as it is for someone who maybe just never once in their life has eaten meat. For me, in my predicament, I've decided that it's more appropriate for me to engage in a meal with people, to be pro-social, to share a meal, to break some bread with my team and with other people, in an effort to be pro-social, which is ultimately what the Stoic aims to do, is to be pro-social. But again, it's a nuanced thing. If you are someone who was born into a vegan family, you've never eaten meat before, man, like maybe the more appropriate action for you is, hey, I'm going to sit and enjoy a meal with you, but I'm going to bring my meal from home. I'm going to prepare a meal, bring it here. We'll all eat together, but I'm going to eat my own meal. So I don't want this to be something that ends up being like moral relativism, because it's not. Stoicism, it's not moral relativism, but it does take into account who you are and the context of the situation that you're in, the context of the environment that you're in, and also the context of the society you're in. So, is a Stoic vegan? Well, no. Veganism is an ideology. Stoicism is a philosophy. They can coexist depending on your who you are as a person, and sometimes they can't. And let me give you a bit of a forward-thinking notion here, because this is really interesting, and it might set into stone maybe a little bit of confusion about this. So let's go back to hunter-gatherer days when we first, as a species, started hunting. Can you say that none of those people were Stoics because they were eating meat? Well, of course not. You could say that some of those hunter-gatherers, our ancestors, were Stoics. It depends on, who they were as people. Now, fast forward to Marcus Aurelius's days, where you start to have some people that were vegan. Maybe the Stoic thing in that context, in that environment, because there was more food options, because you started to have bigger cities, maybe it's appropriate for you as a Stoic, as an aspiring Stoic, to limit your meat exposure, maybe be a vegetarian, maybe not be a full vegan because at the time it's really difficult or perhaps impossible. Then you fast forward to today, where it's even easier. So there is the option now to be a vegan. I did it for 3 years. My health was excellent. So there's no health issues whatsoever. Did it require lots of planning? Not really. I mean, people think it does, but it really doesn't, because what happens is you just get into a habit and you just follow that habit through in your daily life. And, whether it's you take a B12 supplement and you make sure you get beans and a grain every day and you make sure you eat lots of vegetables and berries, that stuff just becomes a daily habit. It's not something that you consciously think about. So it's possible to be a vegan today, in today's world. Let's say if you live in a big city like, I don't know, New York. Man, you have so many options to be a vegan. So many good options. You can be that. Is that appropriate in today's climate? It could be. It very well could be appropriate, and it could be a stoic act. 2,000 years ago, maybe less so, maybe much less so, maybe a vegetarian, maybe not a vegan. 10,000 years ago, probably no, like there's no option for you to be a strict vegan. I mean, you die, and that's not a stoic thing at all. So we went from 10,000 years to 2,000 years ago to modern day. Let's do something here. Let's speculate. Let's go 1,000 years into the future. Let's say in 1,000 years, who knows what that's going to look like? Let's assume at that point in time, we found a way to either produce meat without suffering or to design a diet that has changed over 1,000 years and progressed towards being a completely vegan diet with no suffering on animals whatsoever. So in that environment, let's just imagine this, this maybe if you're an anti-vegan, let's imagine this dystopian future where you don't need to eat meat at all, and most people don't eat meat. Eating meat becomes kind of like this weird thing, this rare thing. Well, in that case, it would be inappropriate for you as a stoic to kill animals and eat them. So this is a very interesting point with stoicism, is that because it's a framework and it's a philosophy and it's deeply nuanced, it doesn't really give you the answers like, is it appropriate to eat meat? Yes or no. It doesn't give you that answer. It says, well, no, it depends, man. It depends who you are. It depends on your environment. It depends on what society you're living in. It depends on the availability of everything. It depends on where the cosmos is in its development. So, that long arc of history, that long arc of us improving things over time, the Stoics agreed that there probably is like an objective morality up there somewhere, but they also understood that we don't necessarily know what it means. All that to say, if let's say you're thinking about this veganism thing or maybe reducing meat, like ask yourself, what's appropriate of me? If you have been eating supper every Sunday with your family for the last 30 years and you always have meat, let's say meat is a core part of this meal that you have, maybe it's appropriate for you to still have meat. Maybe it's appropriate for you to have like a smaller portion. Maybe it's appropriate for you not to have any. I don't know. That's something that you have to think through. So, like everything in Stoicism, one of the drawbacks, but really the strength of it, is that it requires you to use your prefrontal cortex. It requires you to think. So, is it stoic to be a vegan? Not inherently, but a stoic could in fact be a vegan. Of course, it depends.